This is Ithaca. If you are unaware, this is the location around which the Odyssey is largely set, and having just seen the film last night, I thought I'd get some thoughts down, and I thought it would be nice. One of the things I bring to the table that most other reviewers won't is I've actually been to quite a few of these locations. Not all, but I've been kind of circling Bronze Age stuff around the Mediterranean for a while, including seeing Troy and a lot of the sort of Mycenaean sites around Greece, so figured we'd pepper some of that in as well. I'm going unscripted today, and I'm going to kind of keep it short, though a glance down at the time code will tell you whether or not I've managed at that or not. So yeah, some general thoughts about the film and its historicity. Yeah, I'm going to keep this largely spoiler-free, but then again, this is a story that has been circulating for at least 2,800 years, so the degree to which I can really spoil it for you more depends on your own reading. But yes, I guess just right up top, a major...
Spoilers from history.
Well, from history? Yeah, debatable either way. Just to give my opinions on the film up top, I thought it was pretty good. Interestingly, I've seen, a lot of really, grand praise for it, and I enjoyed it. I had a good time with it. It just didn't, massively move the needle for me in the way some other films have. I don't know if that's going to get some aggro my way from just saying, it's kind of all right. Something that did crack me up, I was always going to be looking at this through more of an eye of okay, well, what's the historicity like? And, we all knew going in, because we'd seen the materials, there were going to be no boar tusk helmets, no big sort of hide shields. This was not an attempt by any means to try and recreate the actual aesthetic of the Bronze Age, for which we have quite a number of sources. There's quite good wall paintings that have survived from various locations where we can kind of see what these people look like. We have a lot of their arms and armour, so we're not without a clue of how it looked, but that was definitely just not going to be the thing. In society, this, which is sort of roughly modelled on the Corinthian helmet, there's other different types from different Greek locations, so I'm not going to go into the exact taxonomy of what this is. I'm sure it's like a custom build for the film. Anyway, that is just so synonymous with the feel of ancient Greece that, it's perhaps unsurprising that's the look they were going for. I'm aware there are a lot of explainers circulating for this and how it fits into the historical context, so I'm not sure how much of my audience already knows about this. Just very briefly for the uninitiated, most of the ancient Greece you're probably picturing in your head, the sort that you were taught about in primary school, is probably coming from around 500 BC onwards. This is known as the sort of classical era. This is when some of the big events are happening around Athens, the war with Persia, and then a bit later the Peloponnesian War, that's Athens versus Sparta. So a lot of the really iconic Greek stuff and also democracy and theatre, that's all going on around that time. Whereas Homer's Epics, that's the Odyssey and the Iliad, those are taking place, we think, in the Bronze Age. Now, I'm not going to, again, there's much more qualified academics that can talk about, and this is something you can devote your entire life to, like unpicking the Homeric Epics. While there are lots of very accurate depictions of Bronze Age life in Homer, stuff that has corroborated very well with the archaeology and things we've discovered, there's also details which are kind of anachronisms, strictly from a sort of later Iron Age perspective. There's a lot of question marks. We think that these were circulating around sort of 800 BC onwards, what we'd probably call this sort of just after the Greek Dark Age, we'd probably call it the Archaic era, and they'd be only written down later. These were, this was an oral tradition of epic poetry. So it's sort of largely describing the Bronze Age world, but it's far from perfect. So anytime you approach the question of did this really happen? It's well, which bits are you referring to? Yes, there appears to be a palatial complex here, and so this list of Greek locations in the Iliad, for example, that seems to line up very well with the archaeology. But then there's other stuff that just doesn't line up with what we know about the Bronze Age. So that's a very quick overview of how the historicity, in the way that historians often have to present to the public. It's no, sorry, it's not just a binary yes or no. It's this whole mix. You have to really disentangle one detail at a time. So yeah, my viewing experience of the film was going to be a little different from your sort of average member of the public. I will say that while I found the film to be generally enjoyable, there were some kind of amusing quirks of the screenplay which I kind of felt that weren't handled very well. There is a really funny line. It's this isn't much of a spoiler. Right near the end of the sort of third act of Matt Damon's giving this speech, And he says something approximating like, "Man, this Bronze Age sure do be collapsing, yo." Like, it's not even much more, like, eloquent than that. It's something like, "Ah, yes, this age of bronze, it is collapsing." It's a line, something like that, which is just a really funny thing to say. Like, the fact that was that like a studio note that we need to get the phrase, like, Bronze Age collapse into the film, just so like people get like, that's it. It's just really funny they put that in there. It's kind of like two people kind of like greeting each other in the street, like in 2026, be like, "Good morning, good morning, neighbor. Wow, this sure is a Holocene epoch we're living through, isn't it?" It just I can't believe they put that in there. And around the beginning as well, I think the problem is the screenplay was having to also sort of try and give you tidbits about the Bronze Age, but there was just things like dialogue, you know, the sort of classic, like, "as you know," kind of dialogues, you know, like, Tom Holland going up to Anne Hathaway and them instantly going to like, "Oh man, sure does suck that Odysseus has been away for this number of years. Ah, yes, that is a very bad thing. Thank you for bringing up that very obvious point that we both are very acutely aware of." So yeah, a little heavy-handed there, but you know, they're sort of hand-holding the audience a fair amount. And because I knew some of the plot points going on, I'm not a Homeric scholar. I'm not trying to sit on some big high horse like, "Oh, I know so much about this." Like, there's plenty I'm not sort of caught up on. So if you're going into this knowing the rough contours of the story, then yeah, the hand-holding feels a little unnecessary. One thing I will say in praise of the film, the scale feels very appropriate. I think maybe if you compare this to sort of Troy with Brad Pitt, you know, it's this big cast of thousands, very much sort of a sword and sandals response to Lord of the Rings. The key was clearly just to make it as big as possible. And while it's always very hard to get an idea of, you know, like sizes of battles in this time, of course, you know, whether or not the Trojan War even happened is a massive open question. So, you know, we can't get definites on that, but we do have the archaeology of, for example, these Bronze Age Mycenaean palaces. And so we have an idea of sort of how big they were. And, you know, they are not these cathedral-like spaces. For example, they would often have great halls with maybe a sort of ceremonial hearth burning. This was known as a megaron. And we have those. I mean, you're seeing the footprint of this one at Tiryns, for example, and there's, you know, others. And so we know the footprint of these. They're not massive. You might compare that particular part of the sort of palatial complex to sort of like a, you know, village community centre. So I think it was good that they kept the scale. The film is definitely on a very sort of personal level. It's very character driven. There's lots of, you know, sort of depth of field type focus shots where the locations in the background is largely out of focus. You know, at one point I was kind of trying to peer around the actors when they're having this conversation to see, like, did they actually film this in Ithaca? It turns out, I looked into this later, they filmed most of the Ithaca stuff on an island to the west of Sicily, which I'd not come across. Amusingly, as I'm sort of showing you this footage, you might have sort of seen the news reports that they also were filming in Scotland, and some stuff was done in Iceland, because they're going for a bit of a sort of desaturated colour palette, you know, something a bit more moody, a bit more Nolan coded. It kind of makes sense. Like when you go to the Mediterranean, means, for example, this is on Kefalonia, just opposite Ithaca. You know, these like violent electric blue waters. It's very, you know, euphoric and very like, yay, summer, woo. You know, it feels more like a sort of Jet 2 holiday advert. You could see how that might just not quite match the mood they were going for. So that's why a lot of it was not filmed in the Aegean, because it's just too pretty. It's too, like, lovely and wholesome. So, again, very sort of personal film. And again, the sort of numbers in most of the scenes were not this sort of cast of thousands, but, you know, like maybe double, maybe low triple figures of people on screen for some of the sort of larger events, which kind of felt about right. I mean, this is the funny thing about scale. What you're seeing on screen right now, these are the ruins of Troy. And just a bit about Troy real quick. We visited this back in 2021. It is a funny sight. When Troy was first excavated by a guy called Heinrich Schliemann, who, you know, used dynamite, amongst other things, to excavate the site. Yeah, not very sympathetic archaeological work done there. he was excavating what's known as a tell, which is sort of a big mound where sort of one generation has built their buildings on top of the previous generation. And so you can sort of go down this layer cake. If you look through the information boards of the site, they cite about like 10 layers of Troy, the 10th being sort of the latest, like some Roman layers there. We tend to put... I always get this wrong. Rather than getting this wrong in the voiceover booth, I'm just going to flash this up on screen. Yeah, sorry, I've not done my homework in advance of this. I'm mainly speaking off the cuff. This is the layer that we would most associate with the Trojan War if it happened, because there's a destruction layer there. I mean, I say destruction layer, the city's been rebuilt at least 10 times. Like, what do you want? It's funny because it is not on this sort of monumental scale that you might expect from fiction. Fiction will try and make things, sort of Mont Saint-Michel sized or taller. Whereas when you go to Troy, you're kind of walking around these walls, which are, pretty chunky, but they're not on this sort of vast fantasy, almost of Lord of the Rings kind of size. From memory, what's been excavated so far is mainly the citadel of Troy, and actually out in the plains there, I believe there's a lot more archaeology of kind of the more prosaic parts of the town still under the soil. It was huge enough, like archaeology that was done at Troy and places like Knossos. It was done on a scale that we just simply don't do anymore, mainly because they weren't, really, worrying about the details. It was more sort of like treasure hunting, really. So the precision with which we excavate now means that we do so, very precisely, and it really takes a long time. So that's why, a lot of these sites remain under the soil. And of course, this does speak to sort of the embellishing power of storytelling. You're just hearing these words being narrated, and, your mind conjures up places that are so vast and unassailably huge and beautiful, and wow, isn't it incredible? Not like, this rubbish place where I live, but just imagine this glorious past. And of course, this is the context in which the Homeric Epics are being performed. The Bronze Age, a lot of these ruins were sitting in the landscape, sort of Mycenae and other places. So people saw these sort of huge blocks making up these vast walls of these now long sort of decayed and ruined things, and wondering like, oh my goodness, what on earth happened here? It's telling they called this masonry Cyclopean because like, oh man, it's so big, only a giant could have put this here. So that's kind of, how this works. We imagine the past with this sort of, oh my goodness, I bet it was so much more amazing and beautiful and huge than what we've got now. And of course, you put a spade in the ground, and the reality is often like a little bit disappointing. Minas Tirith, this most certainly is not. Now, while in 21st century geography, Troy sits in the northwest of Turkey, just near the Bosphorus and then into the Black Sea, which would have in antiquity been a very significant trade route. Of course, the concept of what is now Turkey and Greece, the modern nations of, just bears no resemblance to antiquity and the Bronze Age whatsoever. They were Hellenic. I mean, maybe I'm hesitating to use that term in the Bronze Age context because it's a bit more complex, but there were some trade networks of all of these places along the coasts, sort of everywhere around Anatolia, through into the sort of what's now the Cyclades and the Dodecaes, and what we'd now recognise as the Greek mainland. There was so much sort of interconnection between these locations. A key plot point in the film is that Telemachus goes to Sparta. It's interesting. Again, this is not much of a nitpick. They sort of show them landing at Sparta, kind of like it's sort of like got a coastal port. If you visit Sparta now, again, there's not loads from the Bronze Age there. You're seeing on screen now this fragment of a palatial complex, which is sort of on a hill kind of overlooking the valley. There's also a temple there dedicated to Helen. Helen, which we know as Helen of Troy, in the story starts off as Helen of Sparta. So yeah, while it's a proto, I guess, Bronze Age Sparta, because of course this doesn't really bear much resemblance to what would become the sort of later classical era Sparta, which would come to blows with Athens, for example. It's not particularly close to the coast. It's not a big stretch of imagination that they would have had, like connections to the sea and everything else. So, fair enough. Pylos is mentioned quite a bit. Sadly, while I've been near Pylos, I've not actually had the opportunity to explore the incredible amount of Bronze Age stuff around that part of Greece. We did just briefly see this Tholos tomb kind of on our way. Funny enough, we were actually chasing the Venetian Republic on this particular trip. I've been meaning to go back ever since. There is, for example, this which is known as sort of Nestor's Palace. And again, some of the details, like we have this detail of a sacrifice in the Homeric poems, and it seems to comport very well with what we've discovered archaeologically about the Bronze Age. So again, there's reason to believe that real folk memories of these locations are informing this fiction. Again, it's a little nitpicky, and especially because the location of Ithaca in the stories is sort of heavily debated. We still can't completely solve that one, but wherever it was, Pylos, this is a long way south. I mean, Ithaca is almost certainly an island, at least in this context. There is kind of, again, this is not much of a spoiler, but there is this quite funny thing where Telemachus and Odysseus meet up at Pylos, and they do that classic film thing where they have a conversation. You sort of cut the scene and you clearly sort of transition to a new location, and then they just pick up their conversation like no time has elapsed, as no time on the screen has elapsed. And it's like, I don't have the exact distance in front of me here, but it's several hundred miles and at least a couple of boat trips. This would have taken days at minimum. Well, okay, boat travel being what it is, it would have taken a while. So the idea that you're sitting in stony silence and then you strike that conversation back up again, yeah, I know, silly. It's the language of cinema. I do get that. Yeah, speaking of the location of Ithaca, you might have noticed that I've got these very wide shots of it. In one draft, I was really wondering this year if I was going to try and get a flight to Kefalonia and try and get to Ithaca in advance of the release of the Odyssey. I did not. We did not have the budget to do that in the end. Just a quick geography thing. So Kefalonia is part of a chain called the Ionian Islands. These were some of the first episodes we ever made. It's an incredible place. We are to the west of Greece. Just a sidebar here. It is kind of funny. I feel bad. As someone who's from the UK, I am very fortunate that I can get to these places with comparative ease. It's not super cheap, but I can do this. So for our friends across the Atlantic, for example, if you've been sort of seeing pictures of Greece and you've been thinking about this your entire life, it's very expensive to fly across the Atlantic, so you've got one shot at this, and you're making your perfect Greek itinerary. And so they always put Santorini on there first. Got to see them blue domes, and they put Athens on and everything else. And then they've often seen some things. Maybe they've seen like Navajo Beach on Zakynthos, and so they've got some stuff in the Ionian Islands. And look, it's a fair assumption. I think everyone comes across this at some point if they're trying to travel in Greece. But it's funny, you soon realise that while you're sort of assembling your itinerary between, say, sort of, Piraeus in Athens and getting out to various islands, and then, there's this kind of thing like, oh, yeah, so where is the ferry from Santorini to Corfu? Where does that leave from? Which, in UK terms, is a bit saying like, yeah, so I'm going to Devon, and then, I love Orkney. I really want to see Orkney. Yeah, where is the ferry from Devon to Orkney? Where can I catch that? It's like, no, guys, that's not a thing. This is a very long way we are talking about. There are not regular commercial routes over there at all. So the Ionian Islands do tend to sort of sit apart slightly. And just next to Kefalonia, this is Ithaca, on which I have not set foot, sadly. We saw this while we were in Fiscardo in the north of Kefalonia, but on this trip, we didn't get to actually set foot there. There is a palatial complex on Ithaca. I actually had this slightly wrong. At some point I'd looked into this in the past, and my impression had been like, oh, well, there's this place which is sort of called Odysseus' Palace, but that's a big anachronism, it's actually sort of from later, call it archaic Greece. Yeah, it appears I had that wrong. I have seen a Bronze Age date attached to that. I don't know how optimistic that is. Again, this is not something into which I've done a deep dive at this stage. You do have a lot of traces of the Mycenaeans on, for example, Kefalonia and nearby in the Ionian. So, for example, this is a Mycenaean cemetery in Kefalonia. There's also one on nearby Zakynthos. But yeah, the location of Ithaca, like a lot of things with Homer, it's never been settled with absolute certainty. I've seen there's been quite a lot of weight around the idea that actually this funny peninsula, kind of on the west of Kefalonia, might be a good candidate for Ithaca. Nowadays, this island to the east here is called Ithaca, but whether or not that is how it would have been understood in either Bronze Age or Archaic era, Greece is unclear. A little bit of a diversion here, but I couldn't help but notice, this is towards the back end of the film, but this isn't much of a spoiler really. It's about the fall of Troy, okay? Troy falls.
Spoilers from history.
Yeah, there you go. There's your spoiler warning. And when I saw this on screen, I was like, oh, it's Ben 8 Hadu. I never know where to put the emphasis. Ben 8 Hadu, Ben 8 Hadu. It's something in there. So this is in Morocco. This is an absolute darling of the film industry. I mean, so many films and TV shows have been filmed there. Everything from Kingdom of Heaven. I don't have a list. Just look it up. Like you walk around there, it just feels like a film set already. It's a sort of mud construction, and they're these incredible places, but they're not very durable. So they've kind of been just redone over the decades and centuries. People sort of kept retouching up these walls because they just simply don't last. So that was serving as a proxy for Troy. Although when I was like, oh, that's so cool, they've been filming at Ben 8 Hadu. Yeah, I've been there. Oh, that looks familiar. So you can see there's clearly a lot of reference from there, which, like, yeah, I get it for the look. But then there were some very convincing fires and sort of towers collapsing. I was like, ooh, okay. I'm presuming they didn't do that bit in the UNESCO heritage site. No, thank you. So looking into it later, it appears they sort of built a replica nearby. You can sort of see what they're referencing there. So I'm edging very slightly more into spoilers now. It's more just like the things the film emphasizes, so this might take the edge off your enjoyment of the film. You could pause the video there if you've not seen it yet, but again, to be honest, I don't think this is going to make a huge difference to you, so just fair warning. One of the plot points that comes up, and anyone who even has a passing familiarity with the Bronze Age, they keep referencing the people from the sea, a not in the least bit coded reference to the sea people. Now, I joked about the Bronze Age collapse earlier. This is one of the sort of most famous kind of reasons posited for a lot of these palatial complexes and just the main civilizations of the Bronze Age, whether it's the Hittites, the Egyptians, the Mycenaeans. We just see destruction layers and all these places go dark, and the writing systems they were using kind of disappear, and things don't pick up for a while longer. So there's this plot point of the sea peoples, which sort of doesn't really go. It's sort of it's this ominous background threat. There's like, is this going to sort of be paid off later? And the film sort of gestures in the direction like, oh no, the sea peoples, that was just people coming back from the Trojan War, just like stopping off at towns and saying like, hey, give us some food or whatever. So I don't know, I don't have anything profound to say about that. I mean, we now believe, the actual Bronze Age collapse was caused by just a whole mixture of factors, various ecological things and natural disasters could have caused a sort of cascade of refugees. So yeah, the sea peoples may have been this sort of loose confederation of pirate raiders formed of essentially climate refugees, but it's really unclear. So it was just interesting that they sort of zeroed on that. And similar to that, just on pure word count alone, the number of times in the film they refer to Zeus's law, and I was like, I'm going to just check my working. I'm pretty sure that's not a thing. And sure enough, this is the screenplay trying to introduce what we'd call the Greek concept of xenia, which is, a thing of hospitality. This is still quite an important value in modern day Greece. The Greeks are generally some of the sort of nicest, friendliest people, and hospitality is really, really valued in a way that in an English context, for example, we simply wouldn't understand. The problem is that this is such a sort of load-bearing concept in the film. They kind of it's almost given as this sort of theological tent pole that is holding up the entirety of sort of Bronze Age culture. So yeah, that's really not a thing. Certainly not in the way the film portrays it. Yes, there was, these concepts of hospitality and that being, slightly sacred. That's absolutely a thing from antiquity and the Bronze Age, but to nowhere near the degree of sort of religious significance, it's placed. They practically say it in the way that, some Christians might walk around saying John 3:16, it's like they're basing their entire lives around Zeus's law. Yeah, I get why that was done in the screenplay, and there's an extra complication here where tracking the religion of Bronze Age culture is quite tricky. We do see, so of course Zeus we know from the Pantheon. Again, if you remember earlier, sort of classical era Greece, more like, getting towards 500 BC versus, Bronze Age cultures more than, sort of 700 years earlier. Again, without having this in front of me, I can't give you a detailed breakdown of which. There seems to be sort of like an early form of Zeus in the Bronze Age, as far as I recall, but not really in his role that he would take on as sort of like the head of the gods, which that's a much sort of later idea. Anyway, that's just floating around. Attending to some very sort of tedious 21st century issues a moment. Something that took me by surprise, and I think is going to take quite a lot of people by surprise. You may have just seen in passing that there was just like this whole frothing kind of chatter sort of in right-wing circles that Elliot Page had been cast as Achilles, and this was met with derision and just so much anger and irritation, and I'd seen like a bunch of videos circulating of people really trying their best to make hay of this, like, oh my goodness, this is what we need, this is the evidence that the wokes have gone so far. And I was confused. Like, you will see Elliot Page very early on in the film not as Achilles. Elliot Page is not Achilles in this film. There seems to be a misnomer that was picked up from early trailers and amplified by this gent, and it turns out all of this like frothing anger was just for nothing. I don't know if the studio explicitly came out and said, hey, that's not true, you guys are being ridiculous, knock it off. I didn't see anything to that, so maybe they're like, look, it's creating lots of chatter, maybe we'll just leave this to kind of burn in the background. I don't know, it's just very strange, because you go into the film like, okay, how's this controversy going to play out? And it turns out to just be a complete non-controversy, because that's not true. A non-controversy. A non-controversy? Yeah. It's just, that's not in the film. And the other thing that got, mostly users of X kind of up in a massive frothing lava was the colourblind casting. I'm not going to expend a large amount of time on this. I'm still agnostic about that whole area in general. I think you can sort of do it on a case-by-case. For a sort of like a fairly frivolous TV show, like, sure, why not? If you're trying to make a bit more of a serious sort of historic biopic, maybe not. Of course, this is a work of fantasy and fiction, always has been. Honestly, I'm just going to tell you exactly what happened. I'm probably going to have people accusing me of like trying to lie, to self-aggrandize. This is the sequence in which it happened for me. I watched the film, so as a lot of you probably know, Lupita Nyong'o appears on screen. That worked quite well. I think that worked just fine. And yeah, like, she's great in the role. It works on screen. Again, it's only really something you're aware of because you're aware there's been this sort of meta commentary argument going on in the background, separate to the text of the film. Anyway, so the film finished. I was walking home, talking to Jen about it, and then I kind of remembered that there'd been this fuss about the sort of colourblind casting of the rest of the cast. And genuinely, my first thought was, oh, wait, but what colourblind casting? And as I thought through, I was like, I think about it, like, picture it, okay, there was that guy. I mean, for example, one of Odysseus's crew is played by Himesh Patel, who's a British Indian actor. Like, honestly, it just really didn't take me out of the film at all, to the point that I genuinely didn't notice. And yeah, there probably will be people like, oh, that's just because you're so woke-pilled. Of course, you'd think that way. And we all know that there are people out there who get furious whenever there's people of colour on screen who are not either villains or just target practice. They are just going to wind themselves up and get mad that there are non-white people on screen in speaking parts. And so any discussion of historical accuracy or DNA or anything is just a very thin loincloth just designed to cover over the fact that white supremacy is now much more of a mainstream opinion. Look, if there are people who have some historical heft and want to talk about this, then yeah, of course we can sort of talk about genetics and various connections in the Bronze Age Mediterranean world, but noticeably without your pulse going up even just 1 BPM. So anyone who really wants to talk your ear off this is already telling on themselves, and no matter what sort of credible arguments they are trying to bring, that's really just to cover over an emotional feeling, and the idea that this conversation is being had in good faith is just a complete non-starter. There is simply no merit to engaging with these people whatsoever. A simple coda to this discussion: The thing that makes the Bronze Age, it's fascinating because the suggestion is that the very metal of bronze may have brought this around. If you don't know, bronze is an alloy of copper and tin. Those things are rarely at the same spawn point. In fact, tin is pretty rare in the Earth's crust, and the main deposits outside of some small deposits, for example in Iberia, your main deposits are either in Cornwall or in Afghanistan. And so, this encourages trade routes of people going further afield. You can see how this gets boats circulating. And as that happens, we know what that looks like, anthropologically, historically. We know that, ideas getting trade, people are moving around all over the place. They don't just pop in for 5 minutes and then leave. Some of them stick around. Some of them start families. There would have definitely been sailors that maybe had a girl in every port. All of the things that we know about sort of seafaring cultures. This is what happens. And therefore, the idea that there are lots of different people living in all sorts of different places around the Bronze Age Mediterranean should not really be a surprise to any of us. And these trade networks are fragile, so we know that when the seas become unsafe because there's raiders or the previous power structures are not there to protect people anymore, you're going to see these trade routes collapse, and everyone is going to be much, much poorer for it. As cultures become insular, there's loads of needs in terms of food that are just not going to be met. Civilization is fragile, and it does best when people are collaborating, and when that breaks down, things get much, much worse. This is wildly uncontroversial, historically speaking. Now, as you've been seeing from this episode, this is such a corny segue. Okay, I'm going to say it. We've been on a bit of an odyssey ourselves. But look, okay, it's true. Like I said, we've been exploring Bronze Age sites all over the Mediterranean and, of course, a bunch of other ancient places besides. Not long ago, for example, we were just catching some of the Tholos tombs on the Sunian Cape. This is just a little south of what is now Athens. And then just across the water, also catching various ancient things on the island of Kea, including this Bronze Age complex here. And it's this big unfinished thing we're still in the middle of. Like I said, we need to make it to Pylos. We've done a fair amount around the Cyclades, but still a lot more to go. And that's just in the sort of Hellenic world. Like further afield, whenever we get the chance, we're heading to the Iberian Peninsula and catching some of the traces of Al-Andalus there. That is just such a treat. Going back even further before the Bronze Age, catching the Neolithic wherever we can, whether it's sort of standing stones all the way out in Scotland or these incredible Neolithic temples on Malta. Just the sheer number of Roman sites you can see just all across the Mediterranean. It's going to be years before we've suitably caught up on all of those. In the episode just before this, we were exploring not just Pompeii, but also Paestum, which has these unbelievable sort of classical era Greek temples, but this is on the Italian mainland, which is probably not the first place people picture sort of see these incredible Greek ruins. So yes, this is a huge work in progress. Of course you know what I'm going to say, but if you could subscribe and more crucially hit the bell, because this platform, to be honest, is kind of throttling us at the moment for all we're doing, and everywhere we've been, view counts are massively down. I have no idea whether this slightly opportunistic episode is going to get anywhere or nowhere. But certainly, if you want to catch more of what we've been talking about, we have playlists. We've got this huge playlist on Greece and the Greek islands, which we're continually adding to. There is just so much in Anatolia, what is now Turkey. We've also got a playlist for that. And close to home in the UK, we did a whole series on hill forts last year, and we're actually gearing up to do a season 2 starting in the autumn. So yeah, just throw those on and see what you find. If you enjoyed the music in the background, it's ours. We make all the music for these episodes, and you can catch it on bandcamp.com. If you want to support us by flicking us a few quid, that's the place to do it. Otherwise, to see what we're doing on more of a sort of week-by-week basis, follow us on Blue Sky. We've got a lot going on there. And otherwise, yes, we'll catch you very soon.